right, those who are still here, we're in the 5th chapter of the first letter of John today, as we near the end of that first letter, and then we have 2 other letters that he wrote, 2nd and 3rd John, which are both short, and so we will deal with rather quickly in the coming weeks. But we're going to take a little bit of time and actually slow down a little bit as we wrap this letter up, because there's a lot in the closing of this letter that we need to address and talk about. It's very much the climax and what John wants his church to understand. As we jump into it, though, let's just remind ourselves real quick for everybody exactly what this context is. Again, we've got a church to which John is writing that has suffered a split, a division. There have been a number of people, the secessionists, those who have left, who have been denying that Jesus was in fact the Messiah, the Christ. Again, it may have been some sort of Gnostic thing. We don't know exactly what they were saying, but we know that they were, given what John has said and the way that he makes sure that his church knows that they are, in fact, proclaiming that Jesus was real. He was came as a human being, as flesh and blood, but that he was also the Son of God. The rebuttal that John provides to them lets us know that they were denying that case, right? And so this church has been rocked by that division and the separation. If you've ever been in a church that has a division, you know that that is unsettling. And even after that has sort of passed in time, a lot of churches carry those scars and those wounds for quite some time. And if they're not addressed, I've been involved in a number of churches where that's been the case. It can be a generational pain. It can be a problem, right? And so this is a real problem, right? And so this is a real problem that not only John's church has, but many churches have. I'm sure in this church, it's 200 years old. There have been a number of those. It has in fact spawned 2 other churches. There have been churches that have left here, and those have not typically, but neither of those were really amicable. They were over disagreements. And so whether or not they left in good spirits or not, there's that pain, right? There's that the family has been torn apart. And that is what has been experienced here in John's church. And he's trying to, again, assure those that remain as the church of their status, and we're going to talk about it today, as children of God, right? He wants them to understand that they, in fact, have heard, and we've heard him say now 3 or 4 times throughout the letter, that the message that he gives to them, that he's writing to them, that he told them when he was with them as they began their life together, was the message of Jesus. He was there. He saw it. Those that came and planted this church and helped nurture it and let it start were eyewitnesses to that event. And so he's, again, reassuring them of the truth of what they are holding on to, again, in contrast to the message of those who have left. And so he's gone through this letter and he's talked ad nauseum about love. And as we get into the 2nd and 3rd letter, he's going to continue to sort of beat that drum. If we go back to his gospel, that was a primary theme of his gospel. So John cares very much about the way in which his church relates to one another and to the world around it, and to God, of course, right? And he is very much understanding and preaching and teaching to his church what Jesus taught to the disciples, which was that the greatest commandments is to love God and to love people, and we're going to see that echoed today. Right? So let's jump into it. We're going to just do verses 1 through 5 today of this 5th chapter of 1 John. So let's read it together. It says, "Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been born of God, and everyone who loves the parent loves the child. By this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and obey his commandments. For the love of God is this, that we obey his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. For whatever is born of God conquers the world, and this is the victory that conquers the world, our faith. Who is it who conquers the world but the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God?" Okay, so as you hear that, what would you say the primary theme is? What was that? Kiefer. He loves children? Yes, of course he loves children. We are children. What was that? He loves God, and he tells us to obey God, right? You got it. The little kid got it. Everybody else is quiet, right? That we need to love God, we love children. He relates, again, there's this relationship, although he talks about it sort of in the opposite way, and we're going to talk about that, that if you love God, you love the children. And so he talks about, and he's using what is a first century understanding of the family and how that constitutes relationships. We'll talk about that as we go. But there's also this conversation about victory, right, of overcoming, right? And so what does that pertain to, especially in the context to which he writes, right? That there's this, again, this split, this disagreement, this division, and he's reminding his church that they have overcome the world and all the pain and all the suffering, which includes that split and that division, the hostility that would have resulted as these people left, as they looked back at those that remain and said, you don't know what you're talking about, we know, we're better, and they went off preaching something else, right? And so, again, this short little paragraph in my text is chock full of essentially everything that he's been saying. This is, in many ways, the climax. We're going to see something about that as we talk through the way in which he even uses language to call out that this is the point, right? This is very much the point, right? And as it pertains to us, as we read this today, we need to, in some ways, acknowledge, and this is in no way a condemnation, it is an observation that we have to have about ourselves, about the church at large, particularly in our day and age, that this time for us, Sunday mornings, is largely, we talked about this I think even last week, for a lot of people, something that we come to, we come in and we receive. You all are sitting here listening, right? We do things a little bit differently. You can ask questions and you can contribute, so it's not simply a one-way conversation, but in most churches it is, and then you leave, right? And maybe there's some songs saying, there's an offering that's taken, so there's some participation to be had, but by and large, most people view churches as things that they go and they consume, right? And the church has been very bad at developing that culture and feeding that culture, and we have this whole sort of primary way of doing church that is a service, and it is a service, right? But it has always been called a service, but it's been a service to God. But we have sort of flipped that on its head and made it a service to the people that come, right? So we're coming as consumers. We have this consumerist Christianity in which we make our, how do most people make decisions about where they're going to go to church? How it makes them feel, right? How many people have ever said or heard somebody say, I'm just not being fed, right? Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be getting something, right? Certainly, hopefully when you come to church, you are engaging something that there is a sort of, a two-way street going, right? But if it's primarily about what I'm getting, right, is the music that I like, or the people that I like, is the sermon given in a way that I like, right? Does it serve me? If it's primarily and almost exclusively that, then very much we have sort of missed the point, right? That it is, we sort of all would say, and we understand that it is something that we should be coming to give to, right? And participate in, rather than simply receive, right? And the result is that very much the church at large, when we leave, if we just come, we receive, and then we leave, what does the rest of the week look like for us? Does it look much different than those of our neighbors who don't come to church? Right? For most of us, and I'll be honest, when I was in my job, when I was working at a bank, or whether I was using my marketing company, when I went to work, right, unless a conversation came up and we were talking about faith, the people that I worked with probably didn't know that I was a Christian. And I couldn't look around those environments and tell you that person is or that person isn't, right? And this is just the culture that we have developed as a church, is that we don't understand, and this is what John is trying to drive home. We don't understand. First of all, at the core, it's an identity problem. We don't understand who we really are, And so what we receive when we come to church doesn't fundamentally change how we are. We don't understand who we are, so we don't understand how to be in the world, right? And when we understand what John is saying, when we understand what Jesus was teaching and leading his disciples through, and they in turn lead their churches through, it is an identity shift, right? And that identity shift, when we truly understand it, when it becomes integral to who we are, it changes everything. And we live our life differently, right? And this is why across the New Testament, in many places, it talks about how the world doesn't know us or doesn't understand us. John has already talked about that, right? That the world will hate you, it will reject you. Jesus says it will hate you on account of me, right? That because you understand who I am and you become this new being that is like me, the world will not like you. And so, again, this isn't to condemn us. It is just to call out for our attention, for self-reflection, the extent to which we probably, if we're honest with ourselves, don't live a life that is any different or causes people to look at us and be like, ooh, that's weird, or that's different, or why do they think that, or why did they say that, right? We probably don't live a life that's actually much different than someone who doesn't claim to follow Jesus. And then we have to ask ourselves why, right? And so in this context that John writes to, like we said, this church they're shaken, they're uncertain about what's going on, and they're probably wondering a little bit whether they've gotten it right. Are they the ones that are wrong, or is this group the one who's gotten it wrong? And so John, in this letter, and particularly in this section, is writing, and his response is to remind them not only of the doctrine and the truth of what he said, but of their identity, right? He wants to be very clear-eyed about who they are. And from that then stems all of the rest of what we ought to be doing as a church, what they ought to be doing, and how they understand their life, right? And so he begins, he says, everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been born of God, right? And this is that theme that we've talked about before. Jesus talks at length about, and this is new birth, right? And as he says, has been born, right? This is the actual Greek phrase. I'm not going to get too far into it, but it's what's known as the perfect passive participle. And this is something that has happened but continues to happen, right? Greek is interesting in its tenses. It doesn't map cleanly onto English, right? And so when we say you were born, like Shelby, that's my niece, sorry. Shelby was born. We were all born, right? Are you still being born? No. Well, in a spiritual sense, right? But in a human biological sense, no, you were born, right? She was born, what, a year and a half ago now? Roughly? Yeah, just about, right? But that was an event that happened, and it happened and it's over, and now she's growing, right? But the way that, even the language itself, certainly we know as a spiritual reality, we are still being born, but the language itself is given to us in a tense in the Greek that says that very clearly. That this act of birth, new birth, is something that happened, but it's continuing, right? So it's not a one and done thing, but it's a process. And again, we've talked about that, right? But for John, it is how and why, right? Everyone who believes, it is that birth that gives rise to, or that birth is caused by the belief or the confession, right? It is those who believe that are born again. So it is the belief that triggers this reality of new birth, right? And this comes down, and this echoes what he's already said. He says remember he gave us a sort of litmus test to figure out who to listen to, that if someone denies that Jesus is the Christ, don't listen to him. And we talked that week about how that's not the only thing we take into consideration, but in this context, someone who says Jesus is not the Christ, you can pretty much write off. Right? They're not spiritually authoritative. It is that confession that initiates and creates the status as having been born again, right? So these cessationists, the people that have left, are rejecting that confession that Jesus is Christ, right? It is saying and confessing that Jesus is Christ, that he is the Messiah and the Son of God, right? Those are two. As Christians, those are the same claim, but those are distinct claims in that first century. Remember, Judaism was expecting the Messiah, the anointed one, but he was a human being. He was the one that God sends in order to usher in the day of the Lord, in order to restore Israel, in order to throw off their enemies, right, to usher in an end to the exile, right? And Jesus certainly is that. Jesus is the Messiah. Messiah is the Hebrew word. The Greek word for that is Christ. Those are the same word. It means anointed one, king, right? And so they were expecting the anointed king to come. Jesus is that anointed king, but he also happens to be the Son of God, right? And so for John, this is really a really important distinction that we latch on to both of those things, right? And they are two sides of the same coin for John and for us, but it was a remarkable statement to be making. No one thought that was going to be the case, and again, one of the reasons that sort of belies two of the reasons why Israel would not have accepted Jesus as a Messiah, or would have good reason not to. One, he died, right? So the Messiah was to be the conquering king, and to have died means that you're not. We've talked before about how there were many messianic claimants, those who claimed to be Messiah. They sparked a revolution, both before and after Jesus, and Rome came and killed them, crushed them. And then when that Messiah died, everyone looked around and said, well, I guess it wasn't him, and they went home and that movement died, right? One of the remarkable things about the Jesus movement is that it didn't die, right? When all of the others did, and there were others. And so one of the questions is, why not? And that itself lends some credibility to the claim that he was resurrected. But as a Jewish person living in the first century, you look at Jesus and see him on the cross, you're like, well, it's not him, right? So he was not ushering in the day of the Lord, right? So we would deny that he was that, right? Excuse me. But also the idea that he was the Son of God, that was heretical. That was blasphemy, right? So when the church looked at the message goes out to the Jewish people, and they're carrying this message that Jesus was in fact the Messiah. Well, one, he wasn't because he died, and two, he's claiming to be God himself. Well, that was not expected. That was a shock, that it was God himself who came in flesh as Jesus, and he was the Messiah. That would have been blasphemy, right? And so there was many reasons why people would not, but John's point is that it is a confession of both of those things together that launches and triggers this new birth, right? That launches us into a new life. We've talked about this the last couple weeks, but it is that new identity that results in that confession that is what John is trying to get us to understand, right? And again, the secessionists, those that were going away, that had broken off, were very clearly saying that was not the case, that he was not those things, right? And so while we would say certainly that the right belief is necessary for being begotten or new birth, right? We have to have a right understanding. That is not all, right? What John has been talking about is that right understanding then leads to a way of being in the world that balloons and blossoms into love of God and love of neighbor, and that it becomes more than just, it's not just doctrine alone, of course, right? But it is very much doctrine and a right understanding of Jesus as Christ, as Messiah, and as Son of God that gets us into the family, right? It is back to the beginning of his letter and back to Peter's letter, when we understand that Jesus is God and Jesus is Messiah, and we just turn in order to follow him and turn away of the life that we were living that was outside of that reality, everything has changed. Right, and that we talked about as the moment of justification, as a being set right before God, and it launches us on the process of becoming, which the big word is sanctification, the becoming right, the becoming like Jesus, right? Now, I want to take one moment here, and there was a conversation that came up this week, which I think has interesting corollaries, and so it's a little bit of a side conversation, but also, I think, helpful, right? And that is, what do we do with other world religions, right? What do we do with Judaism? What do we do with Islam? What do we do with Buddhism and Hinduism and all these other religions that crop up, right? How many of you have heard before that they're all doomed to hell, that they are absolutely wrong, Christianity is right? How many agree with that? Really? Are you just reluctant to raise your hand? Okay, right? Like that's what we're told, right? That Jesus is the only way, and if you don't believe, before you freak out, I'm not disagreeing with that, okay? I'm not going to tell you that's wrong, right? I'm actually going to tell you that's very much right, but what I want to do is massage our understanding and hopefully allow us to be more gracious towards people who don't understand, right? Paul, in his introduction to the letter of the Romans, and the reason this came up was the objection that many people have, and I'm sure you've heard, is, well, what happens to the person who lives in another culture that never hears the story of Jesus? Are they doomed to hell, right? And Paul helps us understand that, and we'll talk about this at length when we get to Romans, but I want to preview it just a little bit today. He says that when someone who hasn't heard the gospel looks at the world and they recognize that there is a divine being, that God exists, and they, in response to that, they fall in line with what we consider a moral code in response to that divine being, he says they become a law unto themselves, right? And what he's essentially saying is that they understand without having the details, right? And so when we think about someone such as a Buddhist who is responding to something, for them it's nirvana and the spiritual thing, right? We can look, there's a charitable way to look at that and be like, look, they understand that there's something, right? They just don't know what that something is, right? And so if we apply what John is saying here to that, is that as Christians, we understand Jesus, we understand that he's the Messiah, we understand that he's the Son of God. And it is that understanding that begets us, that allows us to be part of the family. So we can look at other world religions and say, look, you're after the right thing, right? You have a sense, and we would say that we're all humans bear the mark of God, the image of God, and that the human being responds to that naturally, right? And so we can say someone who isn't yet Christian, and Paul actually makes this argument. This is the argument he makes when he goes to Athens, right? You have a statue to an unknown God. I know that God, right? And what he's saying to the Athenians is, look, you know that there's this God out there. You just don't know who it is, and I'm here to tell you. And that's not Paul condemning the Athenians for worshiping this unknown God. It's actually justifying and come along and say, look, you're right. You just don't have the details, right? And so I just say all that to say that when we go and we approach people who have beliefs that are different than ours, maybe we don't go approach, and it's not a you're wrong and I'm right. It is, yeah, that core instinct that you have, it's correct and it's good and it is a gift from God. Let me tell you about the truth of that. Because what John says, it is the understanding, the right belief, the acceptance that Jesus is that Messiah, that he is that God in flesh, that he is the Son of God, that births us into the family, right? So what we need to be doing is going to the world. I mean, as a Christian, what are we supposed to be doing? Making disciples of others, right? There are a number of things that we should be doing, like worshiping, loving God, loving other people, but one of the highest forms of loving God and loving other people is bringing them into the family. And so essentially we're going out into the world to make other Christians. But the question is, how do we do that? Do we do that argumentatively, saying you're wrong, you're going to hell, and I'm right? Right? And I guess the reason I say all this is to say what matters is that right belief, and I'm by no means undercutting that or saying that, just because they have some sense of the God, they're good, they're not yet in the family. And our goal is to allow them to connect their instinct to the right and true God and to bring them in the family by granting them the knowledge, the understanding that Jesus is that Messiah. It is that God, right? Christianity is unique. It is the only religion that says that God broke into the world to show him to ourselves. So all these other religions have perhaps, and we can debate whether this is true or not, an understanding that there is a God is what they understand. What we understand, it probably depends on the person, but what we can say is they don't understand Jesus, and that's a problem, okay? Right? But there's no other religion that I'm aware of that says, okay, yes, we have this God, and he broke into the world in order to connect with us, to show us, and to unite us with him. Right? And so that's the gift and the message that we have to the world around us. And so as we think about loving God and loving our neighbors and what we're called to do and how we go into the world to make disciples, as God says, or Jesus says to his disciples, is to go into the world, disciple the nations, baptize them. What is baptizing? We've talked about this. You should know this. Yes, it is the initiation right into the family. Right? Go out into the world, teach them all I have commanded to you, which is what John echoes here. Right? We're going to talk a minute about God's commandments. Teach them what I've commanded you and baptize them. bring them into the family, right? That this is the task with which the church is given, right? That we are to be the community of love for God first, but equally one another, that we are to love the world, that we are to go out and I would argue, acknowledge that most people recognize something else beyond themselves and hand them, say, here it is. That something else is broken into the world, and it's Jesus, and it's good, and let's come into the family, right? Did you want to say something? You look like you said, okay, all right. You look like you had something to say. Yeah, sure.
Well, I was thinking about science and how science knows that there is an unknown force that holds all things together. And I had a
Yeah.
conversation with an astrophysicist, and we were talking about God, and he said, well, we believe there is an unknown force that holds all things together. So I opened the Bible and
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if you all are familiar with the philosophical movement of postmodernism and what all this says, right? Like, so this is perhaps philosophy and thought happens in this like abstract academic world, right? But over decades, what happens in that academy filters through the sciences, filters into everyday culture, right? And so the postmodern way of thinking happened quite a while ago, right? Hundreds of years ago. But it has really in the last 30 years become something that the general population understands. And when it happened, the church freaked out, right? It was like the death of truth, because one of postmodernism's core claims is there is no truth, right? One of the things they say is all truth claims are just claims to power, right? So when you stand up and you say, I know this and this is true, postmodernism says, first of all, you can't know that. So the fact that you're claiming that is only your attempt to assert yourself as powerful in this relationship, right? You don't like that? You're a good modernist, right? And modernism didn't like that at all, obviously, because modernism was the idea that held sway for hundreds of years that reason was and logic were like the core of everything, right? If you're familiar with history, again, you can check out if this isn't interesting to you for a couple minutes. I'll let you know when we're back on topic. But Descartes launched the modern project when he said, he had this thought experiment. He says, what can I not doubt? What can I be sure of? Because he was trying to prove that he existed, right? And he goes through all of his senses. He says, I have at times seen things that are not there, whether it's a mirage or something else, or you've all had these moments where you're sure you saw something, it ends up not being the case. He says, well, I can therefore not trust my sight because it's not 100% valid, right? I've heard things that aren't there. I've tasted things that aren't there. I've smelled things that aren't there. I felt things that aren't there, right? So all of my senses, they betray me, and so I can't believe them, right? And he's the one that says, I think, therefore I am. I'm sure you've all heard that, right? That's his conclusion, right? Because I think, I know I am, right? And so, therefore, reason and thought become the bedrock of the modern project and the Enlightenment project, right? And so it's our thought, and it was understood within that time frame, within the church, that our reason was the thing that makes us like God, right? When we talk about the image of God in human beings, it was our reason. And we should be able and we can reason our way to prove God. Hundreds of years pass. That never happens. The history of modern philosophy is one philosopher coming after the one previous to it, pointing out the problems with the one before him. And so it was just failure after failure, right? We continue to try to fix the problem. Every philosopher thinks they have the problem fixed, and then someone comes in behind them and says, oh, no, actually, your argument falls apart here, right? And so finally, a guy named Immanuel comes along, and he writes this massive book. It's on my shelf. If you can't sleep, I highly recommend it. It will put you out very quickly. It's called The Critique of Pure Reason. It's like 1,400 pages. It's one of several volumes he writes, but it's all about reason. And in the introduction, he says this. He has this moment where he says, actually, we can't know truth. All we can know is our perception of truth, right? That we as human beings, we perceive, and all we can know is what we perceive, but what's actually here, apart from my perception, you can't actually say, right? And then he goes on to write 1,400 pages to justify saying, yes, this is paper, right? But the entire philosophical world read that introduction and said, oh my gosh, he's right. And that was the beginning of postmodernism. This understanding that all you can know is your experience. And this is, philosophical relativism, right? It's true for you, but it's not true for me. How many people have heard that said? That's postmodernism, right? Because how can you know it's true? Your life experiences gives you a perspective on the world, right? Which is your perspective, but it's not mine. And so my data set's different than your data set, and neither of us know if that data set actually correlates to what actually is. Right. 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 You can see why the church would freak out, right? Because the church is claiming truth, and now the culture is like, oh, well, yeah, that might be true for you. That might hold true for you, right? But it doesn't hold true for me, right? There's a lot to say about this, right? It became very uncomfortable. It became sort of an evil movement within the church, it was thought to be. But what has actually happened is it has caused that whole Enlightenment project and this empiricism that held sway through those hundreds of years, that period of the church, to sort of move to the side, right? And we're now in this period called philosophical realism, which acknowledges, this is very much the way that science works, right? We can say something about what we can measure, but we also understand that we have to hold that tentatively, because we're going to find something else out in 10 years that may modify that, right? We've seen this in science, right? Einstein comes along, he has a theory of relativity, and everything's good. We have Newton before him, Newtonian physics, right? And it works. And then Einstein discovers something new that's something sort of more below that, more foundational to that, which helps make sense of that, but it also means that some of Newtonian physics doesn't hold true all the time in every place, right? And then quantum physics in the beginning of the last century kicks up, and now Einstein, in his theories, they hold true at the level that he was measuring, but when we go one cent below into the quantum level, it all falls apart, right? And the quantum physics is the thing that's given rise to this understanding that there's something that's animating all of this, right? And there's this theory about dark matter, which is sort of we don't need to get into all that, right? It's a fascinating conversation. If you don't know anything about that, go look at it. But more recently, there's been some studies that come out and say dark matter's not real. There's something else going on, right? To your point, science doesn't know what this is, right? And we kind of look at our scripture and be like, yeah, well, we know, right? We have an answer to that. Is that persuasive to our world? Probably not, right? Most people who don't already believe aren't going to look at that and be like, oh yeah, well, that must be it, right? That scientist maybe in that moment was ready to hear that, right? But here's the beautiful thing that postmodernism has done. It doesn't have to be a rational argument anymore, right? It can't just be a rational argument anymore, right? Because when you give a rational argument, whether it's one of the, like the unmoved mover or the clock argument, or the argument from design, there are these historical arguments from within the church that the church gives to prove that God exists. And you voice one of those to someone, and they look at you and they say, I don't care, right? That doesn't convince me of anything. A rational argument doesn't work anymore, right? But what that has done is has opened up non-rational knowing, right? And we see this. We are in a time, in our culture, that is highly neo-pagan, right? More and more people, how many people have heard, I'm spiritual but not religious, or some variant, right? This would not happen in the modern world. But what that has done, anyone who says that and this is one of the reasons that I brought up this whole conversation about other religions, is anyone who says that recognizes there's something beyond what they see, right? For the first time in a long time, most people are walking around with an innate knowing and understanding that the world is more than what we can just measure and experience. So most of the people you come into contact with, you can look at and say, look, you understand that. You don't have language for that. You just call it maybe some vague spirituality. You understand that there's some power. You may or may not call it God. You may call it the universe. You may be a scientist and know that there's some force. But it presents an opportunity for us to come alongside them and say, you're right. You're absolutely right. That's God. And the fact that we are now open to that experience is an incredible opportunity for the church that we have not had in a long time. We have had to rest on logical and rational arguments to make our case. Now we actually get to employ the power of God in spirit and the experience of God. And that's an amazing thing, right? That has been something that was for a long time taken off the table. And it has come roaring back. And so what we thought was sort of what the church said was a sort of an evil postmodern movement, that there is no truth, has actually been one of the greatest gifts in the last couple generations to the church. I have not talked to anybody that I can recall in the last 20 years, if I said, have you ever had a spiritual experience? They would say no. Right? Everyone has always said, yeah. Now, they don't identify that necessarily as the Christian God, but they understand that there's something there. And that is a remarkable window and opening that we now have. And again, if we can approach them not from a, you're wrong, I'm right, here are the rational arguments, but rather, you are sensing something that is true and real. And it is more real than you have any concept of, right? And I have an idea, I've met that person, that God, and I want to show you that. Let me teach you about that, right? That's a different conversation that we get to have now. Right? And it's a powerful conversation. And then what we have to do then is lead people into not a rational understanding, although, like John says, an understanding, a cognitive understanding that God, Jesus is the Son of God and Messiah, is important. It is that intuition, it is that revelation that begets us into the family, that spawns us in the right direction, right? We suddenly realize, oh, this is God, and now we're part of the family. Right? It gives us our new identity, right? But in many ways, it is an experience of God that facilitates that movement rather than a rational argument, right? And as a church, we have to get our heads around that because our evangelism, our ways of going into the world still, for many ways, rest on a rational argument, right? Even, not that you're wrong to do so, but you open the Bible and say, look, here's what that says, right? That's still sort of a rational argument, right? Something, and there's nothing wrong. There are people who respond to that, and so I don't want to say that that's bad, but there's also an opportunity to say, okay, there is this thing that holds the universe together. What's your experience of that? And no, it is. It is. And that itself might be an experience, right? I'm not knocking that at all. There are many people for whom they've begun to have that experience, and then when you bring in the understanding and the reason, the theology, the doctrine, it props it up, it justifies it, and it clarifies it. And I think that's our task in today's world, is to come along people who know that there's something and sort of take them by the hand and guide them to know what that something is, right? And so this right belief, back to John's letter, so if you checked out on me, come back. It is this right understanding that is important, and it is sort of the moment where it dawns on us, oh yes, Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. He is God in flesh. He is that spiritual, divine reality that I've been sensing, broken into the world. It is, as the scripture says, if you want to know what that divine being looks like, that's him right there, right? Jesus is the exact representation of God, the essence of his being. That's what Hebrews tells us, right? You want to know what God looks like? You look at Jesus. Right? You have questions about the Old Testament, which we probably all do if we're real honest with ourselves, right? We don't go first. This is another problem that a large segment of the church has. We want to define God in terms of the Old Testament. We're Christians. Jesus is the lens through which we look. And I'm not going to lie, that creates tensions, right? What do you do with the Old Testament God? There are many things in the Old Testament I can look at and be like, God commanded that. Would Jesus command that? I don't think so. That creates a problem, right? We can't just say it doesn't, right? But where do we default? As Christians, we default to Jesus, which makes us rethink what happens in the Old Testament. And that's okay. It's uncomfortable for some of us, but that's the way it's supposed to happen. Jesus is the lens through which we see the world, right? because we understand that he is the Messiah. He is God himself incarnate in front of us, right? So the Old Testament is great and it's instructive, but Jesus is the enfleshed divine nature living among us. There's no better example or thing to which we can point and say, that's God, right? It's him. And when we understand that and when we can lead other people to that, that is the moment when we are begotten, as John says. Okay, we are only in verse 1. I told you we're going to take this slower, right? We're going to have to speed up here, right? So into the second half of that first verse, right? Everyone who loves the parent loves the child. I mentioned that he's echoing what was known to be the case. It was understood that, and this is true, I think we can understand this even for ourselves, that the family and the love between children is constituted by the parents, right? Why are they brother and sister? Because they have a parent in common, right? It is the parent that links them together and creates a special relationship that is defined by love, right? How many of you have siblings that you don't really maybe like, right? They might, if they weren't your brother or sister, you probably wouldn't hang out with them, right? Hopefully you don't, but that's a pretty common reality, right? But how many would you still say you love them? You have a deep bond with them, right? We understand that this is true. That the fact that we are spawned from the same parents, even if it's a half-sibling, right? There's a connection there that matters, right? And so the love of the parent and the parent's love of the children constitutes the love of one another, right? It's a sort of a symbiotic relationship in which the children love each other because the parent exists. Otherwise, they wouldn't. Well, let's be honest, they wouldn't exist at all, right? But that was understood and very clearly in the first century. In fact, Plutarch, I'll read this to you, says, Plutarch writes this, he says, excellent and righteous children will not only love one another more because of their parents, but also will love the parents more because of each other. To love one's brother is a more immediate proof of love for both father and mother, right? And so Plutarch, not a Christian, writing about this familial relationship that is constituted by the parents and the children, right? And it's in some ways circular, and John's argument here becomes circular, right? We love each other. Brothers and sisters love each other because of dad, right? I'm saying that in terms of the church. We love each other, right? Because of God. Let's be honest, we would not be here if it were not for God. Most of you I would never know, right? The only reason we're here is because of God, right? And so God is constituting this family, but God constitutes the family. Right, the whole church. The churches across the street, right? Churches across the world, the church of 2,000 years ago is all one family because of God. Back to baptism, we're being initiated into the one family, right? And so one of the questions we have to ask ourselves then is, how do we feel about other churches, right? There is, the Zanesville church is weird. I mentioned this before. It's very siloed and isolated in a way that most of you know I grew up in Atlanta, and churches there seem to be very willing to do things together. Whether we had this thing called Young Life, some of you probably heard about it. You know, all the kids would go off to these camps, and it was kids from everywhere. And you just understood you're all the church. You went to different local churches, but you're all the church, right? When you get together, it's all the same family, right? And weirdly and oddly, that doesn't seem to necessarily be the case here, which is why I wanted to sort of call this out today, is that Trinity Lutheran, Trinity Methodist, Grace, North Terrace, Cornerstone down south, we have differences, right? But we're one family. Right? We need to understand that. They are our brothers and sisters. They are due the same love and respect that we give to each other, right? And sometimes that's hard. Again, there may be there are churches who are like the brother or sister that you don't love, or maybe you don't like, but you still love. Right? Like, I don't much like the way you do that, right? But you're not heretical. You're part of the family, and I still love you. And we can find the things we agree on, and we can sit around the Thanksgiving table together, right? When mom or dad are sick, we're going to come together and care for mom or dad, right? That our bond is around our mutual identity in God, right? What we don't get to do is hate our brother or sister. That's not okay. We don't get to look at them and say they're other. They're not part of us, right? And the same is true about churches globally, right? We are sitting in a church that's Protestant, but Catholics are Christians, Orthodox are Christians, Coptic Christians in Ethiopia are Christians, right? Anyone who holds to that Orthodox core that we've talked about over and over and over, family. We have disagreements. That's okay, right? They're our family, right? And then he goes on into 2:3, and he concludes this, and he creates this sort of circular logic again, right? Because he has said up to this point, how do you know someone loves the Father? What's the proof? I'm sorry? They love one another. Exactly. The proof is in that they love the people that sit in the room with them. They love the rest of the church. That proves that they love God, right? And here he says the opposite, right? We know that they love one another. How? Because they love God and they follow his commandments, right? It's circular, right? It is, again, two sides of one coin. This is not a logical argument. It is a characteristic of the reality of the relationship that we have with God and one another. When Jesus issues the great commandment, it is not one and then the other. It is both at the same time, right? And the conclusion that we have to draw, that is, all over the New Testament, is you cannot love God if you don't love your brother or sister, and you cannot love your brother or sister if you do not love God. That doesn't mean you can't be kind to other people. That doesn't mean you can't have an affinity for. But in the biblical, spiritual sense, to truly love other people, you must have a love of God, right? And this is why the identity becomes so imperative, right? You have to understand who you are in God's family in order to live the life of love that you were called to live, right? If you aren't grounded and settled in who you are in light of God as a loved child, right, no matter what, you will find it hard to extend love to everyone. There will come a time that you don't feel loved, that you feel betrayed, right? And if you aren't focused on the relationship that you have with God, the relationship between that other person who has done that will devolve. It will not be a loving relationship, right? Because, let's be honest, in many cases, those relationships are not loving, right? If I just worried about the way some of the other churches talked and did things and focused on the disagreement and the differences, the default mode of understanding there is difference, right? I can't help as a human being but see the other, right? And the way they're not like us, right? But if my fundamental understanding about myself and the world is relationship with God, if I'm settled in and understand and feel and experience the love of God, I'm not worried about difference, right? I'm worried about acceptance and love. First, the one that I've received, the one that I mirror back to God, but then that can be extended to others in spite of difference. The primary thing doesn't become the difference, it becomes the Father. Does that make sense? It is a radical perspective shift. And that perspective shifts because you understand your identity. Who are you? You are not simply a Christian who's been given a set of doctrine and ideas and an intellectual belief system that has to go out into the world and get people to agree with you. If that's how you understand yourself, anyone who disagrees with any set of doctrine you have becomes other. So anyone who's not Christian is immediately other. Anyone who goes to a different church that has a different theology, right? One of the first things I did, I knew Andrew because Andrew was the pastor across the way at Trinity. Our kids went to preschool over there, and so we knew him. And when I first got this job, I went over and talked to him, right? And one of the things he said is, "Yeah, we'd love to partner. We just won't be able to do the sacraments together, and that has to do with a theological difference." And I'm like, "Well, that's weird. Like, why not?" Right? But and I'm not knocking Andrew. He's a great guy, right? He's my brother. I love him, right? But that comes from this understanding that, well, we're different. We can't do that together because we're different. When I want to say, and we should be saying, no, we're the same. We love the same Father, right? And that bond and that union is far greater than any disagreement we have over ideas about that God, right? Both are important. I'm not discounting theological discussions and proper understanding, right? But if we first and foremost understand who we are as God's children and as part of the family, we can't look at another church or another Christian or even someone who's not Christian and say they're not part of the family, right? Now, someone who, caveat, I realize what I just said, right? I'm not saying that the person who's not a Christian is part of the family in this begotten sense. What I'm saying is they are a child of God that bears the image of God who needs to come to that realization so that they can be incorporated into the family, right? But they are not purely other. It's not like they're a different class of Homo sapien that is somehow not loved by God, right? They have every potential to be a brother and sister, and that's what we should want for them, right? And we should work for that, okay? And then he said here, again, that the family are the ones who love God and keep his commandments, right? That is who the brothers and sisters are, that he is most concerned about, particularly given the context of the split in his church, right? That there is certainly love for everyone, but most importantly, the brothers and sisters that are united by the parent, God, right? And then he goes on to the shortest part of this whole phrase. He says, his commandments are not burdensome. Okay, let's talk about that for a minute. What does everybody think? Should you not have trouble following him? I'm asking them if they agree with what you just said. She said that she reads that and says that you shouldn't have trouble following these commandments. Is that the way we understand what he's trying to say? Not exactly. Okay, help us. Yes. Sure. But does that make them not burdensome? That's what we're asking. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I like all that. All right. Okay, I want to add to it. Does that make some sense? It's just not, again, that this goes, we're turning, we're becoming born again, we're turning, and we're engaging this process of sanctification, but that's not always easy, right? And that's kind of what you're saying, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. It's okay. That's okay. I want to add to this and flesh it out and maybe make our understanding of what Jesus said and what now John is saying maybe a little fuller, right? This word burdensome is the same word that Jesus uses when he goes after the Pharisees, right? And he tells them that all they're doing is heaping burdens upon the people, right? And basically giving them laws that they just can't. It's not that they can't follow. Jesus' condemnation of the Pharisees is not that they're giving the people the law, because the law was God's, and this is before the death and the resurrection, so the law is the covenant. The problem he has with the Pharisees is that they require conformance with the law, but they don't care to help, right? That they put these burdens on the people, and then they just walk off and say, good luck with it. And then when they step out of line, what do? They pick up stones and start chucking them at them, right? And so when John here says that the commandments are not burdensome, when Jesus says, my yoke is not heavy, it's light, right? He's not saying I don't have a yoke, right? And a yoke is a teaching. A yoke was the teaching and the way of life that a rabbi passed on to a disciple, right? And so Jesus is not saying that there doesn't exist. What he's saying is it's light. But how is it light? In John's terms, how is it not a burden, right? it is not a burden, it is not heavy in the way the Pharisees were making things heavy, because God promises to come along, indwell us with the Spirit, and enable us to follow. That doesn't mean that we're not going to have moments where it is difficult, and we have to be disciplined, right? Or there aren't moments when we screw up, and we have to come back and we have to ask for forgiveness, right? You're not wrong. So don't read this and be like, man, this should be easy, and it's not easy for me, so I'm not right. That's not what John is saying. Right? And as a couple of the commentators are talking about this, as we look back into letters from Paul, but also back even into Genesis, we see a couple different ways in which we can understand this. Right? In 1 Corinthians, Paul tells us that God never demands what's beyond human capacity. Right? So in that sense, God's not asking something of you that is impossible. Right? And again, with the caveat that he's going to come along and enable you to do that. Right? You may be not able to do it of your own. Right? In Romans, he says that the burden is light compared to the reward, right? So there's some way in which it becomes easy when we understand what we get in return. And that was sort of what you were saying, right? If I actually follow, it's easier on me to follow than to not follow, right? And I think one of the ones that's the most profound and maybe the most encouraging actually comes from Genesis. It's a story when Jacob, when he serves Laban for 7 years, right? Because he wants to marry Rachel. And in the description about Jacob, he says that it was only like a couple days for him. Why? Because he loved Rachel, right? And so what we would look at and say 7 years of hard labor and essentially slavery or servitude to Laban, it was easy for him because the love that he had for Rachel motivated him, right? And in the context of John's letter, I think that's really informative, right? That because of the love that God has for us, that we have for him, and that we have for everyone else, the commands, they're easy, right? When we yield to God's Spirit, allow him to fill us with that love, it's not hard anymore. It just becomes, it's actually hard not to, right? It becomes a compulsion and here, what are we talking about commandments? To love other people, right? Are you going to slip up in terms of like the things to do and don't do? Yeah, but what we're really talking about here is your ability to love others and to love God when you're filled with God's love is easy, right? When you know who you are and whose you are, right? When that really becomes your identity, then to not love the world and to love others is hard, right? You just naturally want to exude that, right? And then in Philippians, Paul says that God gives the strength to obey. So when we're talking about, in that sense, Paul is actually talking about obeying the commandments, the do's and the don'ts, but that God gives us, again, with his Spirit and that indwelling, the ability to follow, right? And the desire to follow, the want to be in line with God's love for the world, okay? But then that begs the question that I think we need to reflect on, and we're going to take 1 minute, and I want to encourage you to answer. In what ways is ministry, or doing, I use that term, but doing what God is calling you to do, not just here in church, I'm not just talking about being part of a program at church, but doing God's work in the world with your friends, with your family, your coworkers, your everyday life, when does that become heavy for you? Yeah, when is it burdensome? How is it burdensome? When it takes a sacrifice. Okay. A loss of something? Yeah. When you keep hitting a wall. Okay. What else? Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, so just physical restraints and limitations. What makes it feel light? When have you done something that you know God has called you to do and it was a joy? Can you give me an example? When you say when I receive God, I mean, you're kind of I think you're kind of describing what we've been talking about. When you allow God to be your strength, the power, whatever word you want to use. Is that what we're talking about? Okay. You answered too quickly. Fair enough. Anything else? Like anything else that you've done where you're like, yeah, this is good. God wants me to do this, and man, this is fun and it's easy. Or it actually is giving you life and energy. Yeah. When it's merely a duty. Yeah. Yeah. I like that. I love that. Right? The I got to, yeah. The obligation of I've got to do it versus I get to do it. Right? Yeah, and that goes back to what Keith was saying about when it becomes a sacrifice, and it's what is this costing me, right? And to your point, I think what you're both saying is when what is sort of front and center is what it costs, right? And what you're saying is that there's another side to not what it costs, but what do I get to give, right? And both of those things often are the two sides of the same coin. It's back to perspective, right? But it's not always easy to have the perspective, okay, it's costing me a lot, but look what I get to give, right? That's can be a hard place to operate from. It's light when you see results. No, that's fine. Yeah. Sure. Or you go serve like at Christ Staple, for example. It's something you sign up to do because you ought to do it. I don't really want to go. You get up in that morning, you're like, I wish I didn't have to do this. Then you show up and you're serving, and you see the joy in people's faces and the community that's built. And you actually get to talk to somebody, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, this was amazing. Right? And so that sort of feeds you, and you realize, one, you're getting. I mean, yeah, you had to give your time. What was that? Yes. Yeah. 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 Maybe you didn't see that. Maybe they were rude to you and you left, with a chip on your shoulder, and you gave your day up for what? I'm not going back, right? That happens too, right? I want to come back to this in a minute, right? Because as he finishes up, and I think this is really important, we're going to end here. He has this conversation about overcoming, right? This is the victory that conquers the world, our faith, right? What is born of God conquers the world, and this is the victory that conquers the world, our faith, right? It is our faith that conquers the world. What is the victory, right? Victory is the incorporation into the family, right? And you don't see this, again, this is a Greek thing. It doesn't translate in English, other than up to this point, the language has been, in my translation at least, has been everyone and whoever, and now it says whatever, right? And that's a subtle shift that we probably don't pick up on. But in the Greek, that shifts from what is a masculine or a gendered noun to what we call a neuter noun that doesn't have a gender, right? It's an it as opposed to a he or she, right? And what that means in Greek is that it is not simply an individual or person, it's a category, right? And so there's a way to see this that is not wrong, to say that whenever you and whoever, as we've said, accepts that Jesus is the Son of God and the Messiah, right, is begotten into this family, right, and therefore overcomes the world. But what Peter is saying, what John is saying here is that it is the category of people who have been begotten that have overcome the world by the power of Jesus, right? And so it is by becoming part of the community, part of that category, that overcoming takes place, right? And so that is a sort of a legal, again, this goes back to atonement, and we'll get into this in Paul, right? There is sort of like the legal justification of now you're good before God, but there's also the now you're part of the family, and together we're going to support each other, and we are overcoming the world. So Jesus overcame it, and we inherit that overcoming. Victory has been won, but then there's also a sense in which we are incorporated into the family, and we are now actively overcoming the world, right? And again, the tense of the verb is a past action that is ongoing in the same way begotten was, right? So the victory has happened and continues to happen, right? And that victory is, as he says, our faith, right? And both of those words are the only places that John uses these words in his Gospels or his letters. Victory is the word Nike, which is the Nike, the shoes, right? And there's a god, Nike, but it is the Greek word for victory, right? And it is a profound word, and it is interesting and likely intentional that John uses that word here and only here, right? It is a climax of the letter, like victory we have won, right? It's over, right? We as Christians, we love to look to Revelation as the time when God has comes back and wins everything and there's a great battle. But what John is saying, no, that's done, right? And we can talk about Revelation another day, right? So victory is again this climactic phrase for John in this letter, right? And again, what are they victorious over? Sin, death, isolation, loneliness, the group that and the division that has just happened, right? And so the victory is both Jesus's on the cross, but then also the body of believers who have been born again and come together as the family that are now loving God and loving one another because of the family relationship constituted by the Father, right? So all that sort of comes together, and victory is enabled by all of that, right? So I want to end here with really sort of a really practical or contextual thought experiment, or I don't know if this is really a thought experience, or reflection, let's call it that. Zanesville, and a bunch of research that I've been doing over the last few years, right? Demographic data, just lived experience. And when I say all this stuff, I'm assuming a lot of you are going to go, yeah, that's us, right? I've tried to sort of characterize the culture as best as I could for research purposes, for my doctoral stuff. What is Zanesville? If you had to say, what is Zanesville like? Is it a thriving metropolis where life is great for everyone and it's just abundance? Anyone agree with that? No, right? This is the reality of the town that we live in, right? And so as I've put that together, right, like the Zanesville context is characterized by economic despair, right? A sense that nothing ever changes, right? We all experience, or many of us experience, loneliness and isolation from a fragmented community, right? In terms of the church and the Christians, we sense a spiritual drift that's happened in culture at large, but also within the church. We have sort of an erosion of faith that's really happened under the pressure of our culture, and some of the things we talked about, whether it's postmodernism or modernism or the scientific revolution, and what it means, right? And oftentimes, back to the way we started, church and this life together becomes how we just get by, right? It becomes an exercise in how do we survive that, right? I mentioned before that a lot of times, often when I first got here and we started sort of teaching in the way that we tend to teach and have conversations the way we tend to talk, I would get kickback. And the kickback was always something like, I don't come for a Bible study. I come for essentially a pep talk to make me feel good, right? I got those words often, right? And part of me is like, I don't understand that at all, right? But I've come to understand that. Why? Because when you go out there, what you find is economic despair, a world and a community that doesn't seem to ever change. Many people experience loneliness, So we go out there and we don't find God out there. It's not life-giving. And so we need this time. We need Sunday morning when we can come in, we can sit, we can receive, be filled up, feel good about ourselves, and then we can go about our week. And by the time we get to our end of our week, we're tapped again. And we need to come back, and hopefully we come in here and we get a sermon that makes us feel good, and we realize who we are, right? And some of that's what John's trying to do, right? And if that's what we mean when we say, I need to feel good, and I think in retrospect, that's probably what they were trying to voice, right? That what we were tending to do, they were not understanding or receiving in a way or engaging with in a way that was fulfilling for them. That they walked out of here and felt like, yeah, I'm ready to go, right? That should be a moment that when you come into the community of God and you worship together and we study, it should help you feel good, right? It should challenge you. There should be days when you walk out of here and be like, man, I got some work to do. But hopefully you're grounded in a foundation, and what John and I'm trying to do and we're about to do is get us to understand that we are God's, right? That when we realize that we are God's children, that we are brothers and sisters, that we are united because we have one Father, that we are family, that we love each other. If you can walk in here and you know that everybody in here's got your back, right? And you can walk out, and if we, as a church in Zanesville, you know that all the other churches have your back, right? If we can become that community, then we don't walk through our life worried about economic despair or the fact that nothing changes. You don't feel lonely, right? You recognize that there's not necessarily this spiritual drift. Maybe that's happening in the wider culture, but the church itself is vibrant and loving and alive, right? But how does that happen? That happens because we, as Immanuel, and we as the Zanesville church, what John is telling us, we know who we are, right? The victory that we're given, that John says we're given, that Paul says we're given, that Jesus gives us, right, that all the New Testament says, is the ability to rest in understanding who we are and whose we are, understanding that kingdom has broken into this world, and the victory is won. So when we walk out into the world and we see economic despair, when we see the lines at Christ's table or at True Light, we see, I have people I would consider now friends that I know that sleep under the bridge, right? That's not good. Like, that's depressing, right? But we walk out as people who are part of a family and empowered by God who has overcome that. And then we get to say, okay, how can we help fix this? And it doesn't become, I have to or I got to. It's an I get to. Because I'm so filled up and you're so filled up, and we understand that the victory has been won, right? That the future is assured. That we don't have to languish in what we find around us. Instead, we get to fix it. Yes? Yeah, I love that. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. A 100%. Yes. Yeah. And if, back to what I said, if we come in and when we say we come and we receive, we mean that's beautiful. If we mean, I got a sermon that makes sense and it piqued my intellectual curiosity and the music was something I liked and I'm going home, that's not the receiving that we should be getting, right? It just placated me. That's not what we're after, right? Hopefully, I was challenged and I was filled by God in that conversation and in that worship experience and in that experience with each other in the conversations I had before and after church. Being part of this community that is filled and animated by God is life-giving in that way, right? The problem is, so often, church, even this one, becomes, okay, we have this program we gotta do for next week, right? So who's gonna sign up? By the way, we need snacks. So if you're willing to sign up on the sheet for snacks, right? But there again, is that an obligation? Do we receive that as obligation, or Yeah, I get to help support the children's ministry at this church and provide a snack for kids. And some of the kids we have need a snack in the morning. They come hungry, right? That's reality, right? And some of them are just kids and they're always hungry. And to put something in their belly just helps behavior, right? And they're going to learn better, right? And we get to do that for them. Like, what a great gift, right? But we often can hear it out of obligation or, usually it's an I got to, right? Okay, we need snacks. Who's going to do it? And everybody sits on their hands, right? Or we're going to do a family night. Who's going to bring stuff, right? Or we're going to, this week is the meal. Whose turn is it? And everybody sort of begrudgingly does it because we got to do it, right? But if that's the way we're operating, we're missing the point, right? To Chad's point, right? We ought to be so full up that that's fun, that's life-giving, that's a joyous thing, right? And that sounds easy. That's easy to say, right? But does saying that actually change anything for anyone? Is everyone sitting here today and they're like, yeah, now I feel filled up. I experienced that, right? Maybe something has changed here for you, but has anything changed here today? Maybe a little bit, okay? All right, so I'm going to do something. I know we're over time, but we'll probably just sing one song then. Maybe that first one today. What was that? Yeah, we can do the second one. Morgan's making the call. That's fine. Before we do that, I'm gonna just for 5 minutes, I'm gonna put on just some sort of light meditative music, and I'm gonna ask you to just close your eyes. It's a small group, so we don't need to peer around for each other. And I want you to think about a time when you knew God was real, right? Whether it was, like a moment that you experienced awe, right? For some people, for a lot of people, that happens out in nature on a hike. It's happened for me. I've been on a photo shoot before. Back when I was doing photography, I used to do photos at sunset. I would go out to the dam at Dillon, and you'll watch the sunset set over the lake, and it reflects off the lake. Whatever that is for you, sometimes it's a quiet time. Sometimes it's spending time with your family. For those of us who had children, there's that moment I'll never forget. The first moment waking up with Andy, our first daughter, in the hospital. I have a picture of it still. I'm glad I took it. But I was holding her, Joey was sleeping, and I was standing at the hospital window and watching the sun come up, and it was just beautiful, and it was like, yeah, and I think I even posted a photo of the sunset, and my daughter was like, try and convince me there's not a God, right? Those moments where you're like, yes, I know, right? And I think part of the great travesty of the church is we have failed, and this is part of another conversation I had this week, for someone who was coming to the realization that God was real, and that experience of God actually never happened in church. It happened out in nature, right? Which makes sense, right? That's God's creation. You look around in here, we made all this. There's something unique about putting your hands in the dirt or experiencing nature as God created it that helps you connect with God. There's nothing wrong with that. And this person was lamenting the fact that they'd never been told that. And so what they were understanding was there was something out in nature that was divine that they weren't finding in the church, and so church can't be right? And this goes back to our conversation earlier about sort of neo-paganism. I can't tell you how many young, especially women, I've talked to recently that are into some form of witchcraft or sort of, right, because the world is understanding that God is real, there is something out there, but out there is not here, right? And what I'm saying is that the church has done a bad job of encouraging us in the last few centuries of finding God. And if you need to go to the woods, go to the woods. If you need to go lock yourself in a closet and light a candle and say some prayers, do that. Whatever it is for you that connects you with God, go do that, right? Experience God where God meets you, right? I hope that happens here for all of us, but I also know that on every given Sunday, it's not happening for everyone, right? And what I would say is when we go through the routine of meeting God wherever that is, it becomes something that we have access to more and more, and it translates into other arenas. So I just want to give you permission. If God you find somewhere else, it's okay, go there and pray and experience and just sit, right? And so, but what I'm going to do what we're going to do for the next 5 minutes, and that's 5 minutes, and then we'll sing our last song and be done. I want you just to close your eyes and imagine that time or times, and just bring that into your consciousness and meditate on that, right? Remember how you felt, what that felt like inside, what that looked like, whatever that was for you, with the idea that we all hopefully walk out of here having at least a taste of what John is describing. This understanding that God is real, he is our Father, and we are at peace and at rest in him, right? And he has overcome, and therefore we have overcome all things, all right? All right, so I'm going to set the clock in 5 minutes. I hope today, during that last little bit, all that sort of comes together. And if you had that sort of epiphany or that experience of remembering and meditating on a time when God has been supremely present for you, wonderful. I would encourage you to know what that time and that place is and go find more of that. Spend more time there, right? And like I said, the more you spend there, the more that begins to translate, and you begin to understand that reality, and it is carried with you into other environments and other moments during the day. Of course, we hope that this becomes that time so that we all come into this moment together and God is present for all of us and we understand that and it's tangible. Alternatively, if you had no idea what to think or what to meditate because that's not been experienced for you, I really encourage you, and I can't tell you, but please come talk to me, because there are historical disciplines in the church and patterns that thousands and thousands, if not millions of Christians over the centuries have been using to find God in that way, and they are there, and you may not have been ever taught them or given access to them, but if that's not a reality for you, I want you to know that it is, that most of the people in this room, I can tell by faces, have had those experiences, and more than anything else, as a church, as a pastor, what I can do is help unlock that for you, right? I can teach you lots of theology, but if you don't have those experiences, if you don't know God, if you don't know who you are, it's all for naught. Right? That you must, and I don't mean that as an obligation, but I want for you, God wants for you, the whole point of this is for you to know who you are in God. The goodness, the love that he has for you, the love that he has for all those around you, and the reality that you get to go share that love with other people, as Chad said. It's not a have to, it's not a got to, it's a get to, right? And you have to be filled up with that love for yourself. So spend more time living in that presence and that reality so that we can do that. It is a gift from God, and we must take the time to receive that gift, right? But that is the reality that we are called into. That's the people we are called to be. So I encourage you today to go in his grace, his mercy, his love, his peace, and his presence. Amen.